Thank you everyone for attending this research paper session. As a reminder, if there are questions at the end of the presentation, please line up to the microphone in the back. And with that, I'll be introducing our next set of speakers. Dr. Kirk Wakefield is a professor of retail marketing and executive director of sports and entertainment marketing at Baylor School of Business. His research focuses on sports psychology, team sports marketing, entertainment marketing, and fan response to pricing and promotional tools. Dr. Wakefield received his MBA from Baylor and his doctoral degree from St. Louis University. Ann Rivers is currently a senior vice president, director of brand strategy at Brand Asset Consulting, where she focuses on sports franchises, financial services, retail and apparel, home improvement, and nonprofit brands. Ann has an MBA from the NYU Stern School of Business and a BA in economics from University of Chicago. Today, we're delighted to have both of them here to present their research on the role of official NFL sponsorships on brand metrics. So please join me in welcoming the two of them.
Yes.
It's okay. Yeah. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. So the key question that we sought out to answer is really this. Sponsors seek to activate their brand in the minds of fans in hopes of transferring that passion to their brands, thereby enhancing brand image and equity and ultimately brand usage and firm value. So is that even possible? I don't know how many of you were in the last presentation, but they were under the impression that that was not able to be measured, but in fact it can be measured. We'll give them a note. The data that we use for this is from the Brand Asset Evaluator, which is a database of brands that we've been building since 1993. In the US, we have 16,000 people. Oh, sorry. In the US, we have 16,000 people on a panel that respond to the dimensions of 3,500 brands every quarter. And we do the same exact study internationally. So when we look at the data on brands, we can look at brands independent of their category. So we'll measure Poland Spring right next to the NFL, right next to Baylor, for example, to truly understand what people think about the brands. We've also done this to build out a model that looks at really the dimensions of a brand. Oops, sorry. So first, in terms of understanding how a brand competes, when you look at Google, who does Google actually compete with today? Google is an email service. So they're competing with Yahoo Mail. They do offers like Groupon. They compete with the New York Times. So who is in Google's category? So it's important in this day and age to really look in a category agnostic way at what a brand means to a person, because it isn't just about the product, it's truly about the experience. So when you look through the model, there are 4 pieces of it. The first is Energized Differentiation, which is really the brand's true point of difference and how a brand continues to garner its pricing power. If a brand is different, then you're going to accept that it's worth more. Then there's relevance, which is how relevant is the brand to you personally. Esteem is a loyalty measure that looks at regard and if you believe the brand is a quality and a leader in the space. And last is knowledge, which is really a saliency measure and understanding really how well you think you understand the brand. So when you look at them together, when you've got energized differentiation higher than relevance, you've got the brands are more different than relevant. So you get things like Odwalla or Seven for All Mankind, which are brands that are pretty different in their categories and capture a pricing power. So the average tourist that wanders into a Starbucks is generally not willing to pay the $5 for an Odwalla when they're actually looking for a $2 Tropicana or Minute Maid orange juice. Which brings us to the other side. When relevance is higher than differentiation, you get that brands are more relevant than different. Hey, I've got a headache. Do you have an Advil? No. I've actually got a Tylenol, though. Would you want that? So the brand is a relevant brand because you're asking for it by name, but it's not so different that you are requesting just that one. On the back half of the model, we look at esteem and knowledge. Esteem is about loyalty. So I like the brand better than I know the brand, especially since we have a lot of students here. Kaufland will be on all the bridal registries, but most of the brides that put it on the registry don't actually know those brands very well. They just have a high esteem for it. Which brings us to the last comparison. When knowledge is higher than esteem, you get brands that are better known than liked. Spam is up there. They would kind of be hard-pressed to convince us that we don't know spam. So, in order to prove that it's different and relevant and worthy of being loyal, a brand that did a campaign that actually did succeed at changing the brand was actually Domino's. I don't know if you guys have seen that campaign, but the CEO did a full campaign coming on and saying, you told us that we're terrible, you told us that we're ketchup and that we're like cardboard, promise that we're different. So what he was trying to do was lower your perceived knowledge of the brand to go back to the beginning, prove that it's different, that it's relevant to you, that you should actually try it, and that maybe you'll have it every Friday night in terms of being loyal to it and build esteem. And they've actually done that quite successfully. Has anybody tried Domino's again in the past, year? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? So that's about the right percentage of people. Every time I use that example, it seems to be 1 out of 20 seems to be the people that actually have re-engaged with Domino's from that campaign, which is a pretty good success factor. So then, like every good consultancy, we put it on a 2x2, and we've got energized differentiation and relevance, which build into brand strength, which through some of our other academic partners have shown that brand strength is actually a leading indicator of firm value, and a firm that is outperforming its category in the stock market is outperforming on brand strength. Brand stature is the horizontal, and it is a combination of esteem and knowledge, and is more correlated directly to return in a current period, so it's more tied to the current financials. So as brands build, they generally build from the bottom left, where they're new and niche, or new to being niche, moving straight up, where they're more different, and then move to the right, where they become a leadership brand. And you see that 45-degree angle is an important one, because that's where you give up investing for tomorrow by investing for today. Again, the vertical is investing for tomorrow because it's a leading indicator, and the horizontal is actually for today. So when you give up tomorrow for today, you pass over, and you get brands like Old Spice and Macy's. And then you generally fall down to this commodity space when differentiation and relevance starts to decline. You also get a lot of commodity products in that space, or regulated, like the financial services firms as well as some of the airlines. Why is it important? We've shown that in terms of building your firm value, building your brand is the best way to actually build your firm value. You see in the leadership space, the 1.49 times in terms of dollars of sale for intangible value. So by building the perceived value of your brand, you're building your sales directly. So when you're thinking about changing multiples for a firm, this is the easiest way to do it as opposed to cutting costs. So how does it work for the NFL sponsors? Do they actually see success from their association with the NFL in terms of building their brand value? When you compare the positions on the power grid, you can see that the NFL is one of the strongest brands in the database. Out of 3,500, it is one of about 100 that live up in that super leadership space, only surpassed by the Olympic Games in terms of sports properties. The Olympic Games that are actually titled in the Vancouver, the London, those are actually always weaker than the overall Olympic Games. But as you can see, the sports brands are all over the place. So some will contribute more than others and in different spaces.
Yeah, so now the handoff, and I'll stand up here because I need it a little bit on the shorter side, fine with me. But I am from Baylor, so a lot of good things going on at Baylor these days. If you haven't heard, RG3 and a few other good things. #1 women's team in the country, and sorry for the Baylor promotion. But in any case, so we're proud. But that's also how we came connected in this work. So back now, probably 8 or 9 years ago, I started off trying to figure out with the marketing arm with AT&T, basically how to measure this basic question. How do you measure the value of a title sponsorship, AT&T Center or the AT&T Cotton Bowl or AT&T Park and all those? And we started working on a model that actually overlaps nicely with the data that we have here. And the question really comes down to, so how does that affinity, that passion, for the property transferred to the brand? And if you have these brands that are up, as we showed, that are up here in this upper corner, how'd they get there? And if so, did they do it some way by sponsorships? And so the question that we heard earlier when we were talking about the previous session, so the ESPN's Rachel Nichols said, well, when I go into an arena or stadium, I don't buy the brand just because it's up there on the signage. Well, little does she know that she might, really. And it's actually basic psychology, right? So if you're very passionate about something, then what do? I mean, this isn't a class, although you can tell that I kind of do that a lot. But if you're very passionate about something, then don't you pay a lot of attention to it, or her, or him? And you're very alert to everything about that person or that object. Well, same thing, if I'm very passionate about the Red Sox, guess what? I'm very alert and attentive to everything else about the Red Sox and Fenway and everything there is to do about it. And so the fact of the matter is, once you're passionate about something, you can't help but be consistent with that passion about everything you associate with that object. And so it's that's the basic psychology behind it. So what we did, we looked at those who are very passionate about the NFL fans, versus those who are not very passionate at all about the NFL, of course, the non-fans, and try to determine if official sponsors of the NFL actually had better brand attitudes, than do the non-fans. So looking at the model that Ann has developed over the years with, of course, the rest of the organization is helping there, but make that comparison. So interestingly, we started this, I don't have it on this slide, but we started this in 2008, which is great to look at NFL sponsors or any sponsors, because 2008 was when basically everything hit rock bottom, right? All the brands crashed for the most part, and of course the banking industry in particular did, and they were spending a lot of money on sponsorships, and they got a lot of bad run in the press for that. But the issue here is you have NFL fans that love their brand. Is that affinity then transferring over to their official sponsors? And so we looked at 5 categories, and I think it's really important to understand when you do this analysis, and Ann referred to this earlier, but you don't look just at your brand in a vacuum, right? You need to look at the brand comparison and compared to your chief competitors, because they're targeting exactly the same fan, right? And so the brand that may be the official sponsor for NFL, they are not necessarily, they're not the official sponsor of NFL, but they're the official sponsor of Major League Baseball. Each of these categories, they're the official sponsor of something, okay, targeting mostly the same fans. So the question is, are you beating them with your NFL sponsorship? And you can see just there, the basic results where we see for Coors Light and Sprint, Visa and Papa John's in their categories, that they improve their position. Again, the question is, how about compared to competitors? So this is, I think, a pretty interesting chart for, again, the stats nerds that are here. And we can do much more complex ones, but this one's pretty nice. But the issue is, so looking at this time period, we have longitudinal from 2008 on to towards the middle of 2011, but basically right after the crash, where all the brands, for the most part, were pretty low. And I just chose brand relevance for this figure. It's very similar for the other metrics for the brand. But what you see happening is for that green-colored line at the top, that's those brands that are sponsors and among fans. What is their attitude towards the brand? And so you can see over time. So it was like the worst score in the 2008 fourth quarter. All right, so fall, during football season, but right after the crash there. But then over time, the next 3 years, then NFL fans saw a much stronger, rise in the attitude towards these official sponsors compared to their competitors, right, who were, and you can see that line there for, the non-sponsor and among fans, so the blue line. So that gap, that lift, is really the value of being an NFL sponsor. Are y'all following me? Good? Okay, good. Head shakes. I have to do that kind of class occasionally, see if you're awake. That's pretty good. Good sign that you're awake. And then you can see again you also have to compare it to what everybody else is getting exposed to. So this is like basic science class, right? I'm assuming everybody had to take a basic science class and did a little test with the Petri dishes. You're in the test tube, right? So your control group is the one you do nothing to, and then the ones, you do the treatment to the other. And so really your non-fans, for these major brands, they're exposed to every other media, right? From Visa, for instance, for the most part, keeping everything else equal. But the NFL fan is exposed to the NFL sponsorship on top of that. And what we've done in a number of models is we've controlled for all the other factors and their exposure to all the other sponsorships across leagues, and then are able to differentiate that effect of the lift for NFL only versus maybe they're sponsoring other teams, say in basketball or something else. So that's the overall effect. And then what you see, the actual percentage changes for these official sponsors and each of our key dimensions of energized differentiation. What I found over year after year is the key thing is brand distinctiveness or differentiation. You buy what is distinct, right? You don't want to buy what everybody else, all the average types of brands. And so you want the one that's the clear winner. It's the same reason we identify with teams. You identify with the winners, not so much with the losers, although there are some that do. Those are other different psychological reasons. But in any case, so you want to identify with the winner and the most distinct and most differentiated. But they also gain brand relevance and brand esteem and brand knowledge. Obviously, ideally, if you build up all four of those, then you're going to be in a strong brand position. But here it is by numbers, kind of the same numbers you see with respect to the change. But you'll see after the first year, there was still a little bit of a time and recovery for these official sponsors. But then, in the second year after the crash, then they shot back up, particularly with respect to differentiation. The brand relevance and brand knowledge and brand esteem, those shot up, again, pretty directly after the crash there. But then again, compared to what? Compared to their competitors, that's where we're getting the lift of the 48% and 13% and 6% and 3%. So I think some of the faults I've seen in the metrics out there that I've looked at over the years, a lot of times it's comparison to self. So picture that slide, those slides, those graphs, where you don't have the competitors and you don't have fan versus non-fan. You'd get a different conclusion, wouldn't you? Conceivably. And one of these, I don't think we have it on these slides, but in the paper, we show what happens when you, for some of the brands, they don't necessarily do better than their competitors in all cases, because sometimes the competitor is doing a better job of what that's termed ambush marketing, but I don't really like that. I think it's a cop-out to complain about others that didn't do a really good job of taking advantage of their rights. But in any case, the point is you need to know if your competitors are doing as well or better than you. So what should happen in the purchase funnel, when you have this affinity transfer, then, like I was saying before, psychologically, if I associate you with a brand I love or a property I love, then I'm going to feel more positively toward the brand, and then of course I'll use it. So the model that we've developed, here's how it actually works in a sequential fashion. And it's interesting also, if you like to picture things in terms of tables, which most of us do, maybe in here. But you can take this further than just looking at fans and non-fans, but take it by any other number of metrics in terms of behavior. So picture a table, if you will, using these two arrows that I have. How often the fan attends an event and how much media they consume. Then what should happen with respect to the more times I go and the more media I consume, what should happen to the brand attitudes? If you're filling in the box with me, okay, in your minds, then that should be increasing all along. So if I go to a lot of games and I'm consuming a lot of media, I'm exposed to the brand and their brand activation much more. That person who goes to a lot of games and exposed to a lot of media, right? That interaction should lead to much higher brand attitude, and that's what we find. So as the fans attend more events and as they consume more media, then that becomes relevant in the fan's mind, and then they gain that knowledge and they esteem the brand. They make that connection. That's usually where we see the brand activation, where that linkage is, and we have a way of measuring that from the fan's perspective as well. And then, so after that attribution is made, that basically it wouldn't be so good if it wasn't for, AT&T or whatever brand you might put in, there for the sponsor. We actually heard that in an earlier session, really. The answer to Rachel's question essentially was that when you go to an event, it's not the signage, it's everything else that's made good by having the ability to have nice restrooms and nice facilities and everything else because of the sponsor. But frankly, it's much more than that, right? It's all the experience you get because of a good brand activation that goes well beyond nice restrooms for sure. So that makes the brand distinct in the minds of the consumers and makes them distinct from competitors, and then you're loyal to that most distinct brand. And then of course they buy more of it. So the implications for this, the so what, the takeaways, 3 that we had, and I'm sure there are more, but using that 2008 as our point of starting to analyze this, they'd already been in these sponsorship contracts for years before that, at least 4 years prior. Then all the brands kind of bottomed out in 2008, so it gave us a good starting point. But the results basically say that y'all remember this, right? All the hand-wringing about, why are the banks the sponsors? Aren't they just throwing away the investors' money, and the government gave them that money to do what? Spend it on sponsorships so they can go to a lot more ball games and sit in luxury seats? That isn't it at all. What we find consistently is that should, if properly activated, not all of them do that, but that it should actually have a good return on investment. And in particular did for the ones that we examined. The other thing I mentioned was on the ambush idea. So if you don't consider competitors, you can get misleading results, and so you need to make sure that you're looking at them, what they're doing, because it could very well be you don't need the property to achieve your goals. It's conceivable. Sorry, I shouldn't say that, but given how many friends I have on the property side. And then third, measuring the return on the sponsorship investment, according to these effects, fans and non-fans, and looking at brand attitudes is very important, because think about all the brands that are the sports sponsorship and advertising. All the ones that are title sponsors, they're very mature brands. It really bothers me, frankly, when I still see people using media equivalency models, and there are plenty of them out there that just count, the exposures on top of the basketball goal and how much those seconds are worth. I mean, who needs more exposure of those major sponsors? State Farm? I don't think so. All right, they need something like this. And I'll close with, one of my good friends is with one of the major sponsors of, and not AT&T, so I mentioned them a bunch, but of some other major properties. And she said she's seen these reports that said, this is going to be worth $100 million because of, okay, I'll just go ahead and say it, American Airlines. When American Airlines Center was mentioned twice in the NBA playoffs, and this is going to be worth $100-some-odd million, and they scoffed at that number. Why? Because it's not about media equivalency. It's about fans' affinity transferring to the brand. Any questions now? Yes.
No, here I am. Glenn Enoch, ESPN. So I'll start by saying I believe in sports sponsorship. But I do have a question. The base that you set for fan is a really low bar. If I read the footnote correctly, it was people who occasionally or frequently attend or watch, which would be most Americans. If you were to cut it by occasionally and then frequently, would the curves look different, as I think you implied later in the talk?
Right. Yes, they do. Actually, if you just look more at the most passionate fan, then it obviously comes off better than compared to the non-fan, at all. And over the years, when I've run the models, if I can just run that most passionate group, it's such a clear-cut thing. But when you look at the percentage of people who are very passionate fans, like say in the Dallas market, the Mavs fans, the most passionate group, maybe you only have like 6 to 8% of the population that are most passionate. So actually, you can get much more complex than this. This is, yes, a very low bar, I'd say, and you can make it much more sophisticated and break it off into the most passionate, down to the lukewarm, down to the cold, group out there. So yeah, thank you.
And it varies by property. So the NFL, of all of them, has the most number of casual fans and avid fans. But when you look at NASCAR or even baseball, the percentages of avid fans decreases. So it depends on that also.
I was just wondering if you thought there was any like utility in looking at the effects on what I would call like an anti-fan, the way you guys have named people. So like in the paper, you have an example with the Red Sox and Dunkin' Donuts. So the effect the Dunkin' Donuts sponsorship for the Red Sox would have on, say, a Yankees fan.
Yeah. What's interesting is I've done another paper on basically that issue, and what we find is affective intensity can drive still, a positive response because we actually looked at NASCAR in this case, but NASCAR fans are known to really either hate or really love a driver. And what we found was that just that affective intensity, whether it's negative or positive, makes you attend to the information, and so you're still likely to have relatively positive attitude towards that brand. Now, I think there's still more to ask about that to see if what the effect is on that negative side, but it definitely brings the attentiveness to the brand, the rubbing off, and maybe another question.
Yeah, it makes you different, whether it's in a good or a bad way. Harley-Davidson is one of our most differentiated brands, and it's either because people love it or hate it, but everyone basically recognizes that Harleys are different.
Hi, maybe I missed it, but the curve looked really similar to media spend curves, meaning budgets were slashed around the same time that curve was bottoming out. Budgets have improved as that curve has been rising. How did you take into account media spends and media weight?
The ones that we, on the one hand, I'll say we didn't. On the other hand, I'll say, of course, we did. Which is, if you think about who we selected, the NFL official sponsors and each of their competitors. So yes, I would say all of their spends went down, during that time, but then they also all increased. Now, did they increase at the same rates? No, I didn't count for that. I don't know that for certain.
You mentioned briefly ambush marketing. Is there a way to apply this methodology to ambush marketers and see what that return is for them and whether the investment is really worth it?
Yeah, I mean, we looked at these 5 categories. Not every single category comes out, as nicely, and I think where it doesn't come out as nicely, and so the answer, by the way, is yes. And it's like the one graph you'll see in the paper with Coors versus AB, I believe, and Bud Light and whoever the third one was, shows kind of that effect. So yeah, if you're the brand, and I think you could use it to assess: do we need the property rights, and can we do just as well without?
Hi, my name is Marissa. I work at Gillette in our North American marketing. And at Gillette, obviously, we believe in these metrics that sponsorship can drive brand affinity. I was wondering in your research if you came across situations where this didn't work. So we saw a lot of numbers in aggregate, but were there any outliers in your research where it didn't drive brand metrics, and why is that, and what can brands learn what not to do in this space?
Well, I can let Kirk respond, but in general, there's a couple things. One is in spaces where ambush marketing is one of the bigger methods, then the brands may be moving more closely together. And it's also level of activation. So for some brands who don't activate their sponsorships very well, or they just stick the label on and don't activate locally in terms of building fan affinities, those tend to do a little more poorly. So the biggest lesson would be to activate in a true, honest way that's relevant to your brand.
Yeah, Gillette obviously is a good example. We just heard it in an earlier session that we were attending over in one of the ballrooms. But you always account for that spend on the activation. But I can tell you of some brands that I've worked with where they clearly did not do that. I can think of one major brand associated with the NBA over the last few years that we know pretty well, and basically they cut all activation spending. In fact, had $1 million budget, to spend on a $10 million, annual anchorship. So yeah, there's some where it doesn't go well, but it's relatively obvious. And some other work I've done, I've measured specifically the activation among fans for that brand based on several different metrics. And once you account for that, it explains the rest of the variance, in why it would or would not happen. So brand specific.
What adjustments would you make to your model for the teams, especially for us here in Charlotte? We can only have one beer sponsor or one provider of food or in our example, I would say, like, for example, we have a sponsor is Bojangles. We obviously can't also have a competitor of KFC also as a sponsor in the building. So how would you make an adjustment to your model for that?
You know, actually, thanks. But the reality is the fact that we found at the NFL level, at a league level, is relatively astounding to me. But I say that just because at the team level, with proper activation, to me, my experience is it uniformly works. And if you know what you're doing and you're activating correctly, that the model works and the brand changes and the fan affinity follows. So I've not found too many exceptions to that at the team level, with, say, anchor sponsors. But the fact that the NFL, to me, I mean, that's hard if we can show it at the league level, because people aren't really, their passion and affinity really isn't so much for NFL, it is team specific. And I think it's even maybe more true for perhaps NBA. But so the fact we found at this level just means at the team level, we don't have so much to make adjustments. It should work even better at that level. Okay, thank you very much.